Okay, should I start?
Good morning. What happened there? Okay, there I am. Good morning. Welcome to the fourth annual Budget Line of Business annual intro to budget form. Today's session is intro to OMB A-11. Thank you for joining us. Please, in the interim of the presentation, remain on mute. If you have a question, please post that in the chat for us. During the session, the presenters may allow you to come off the mic to have a discussion. Our presenters today is Andy Pavord and Courtney Timberlake. She probably will join us soon.
Yes, you will.
Andy, I'm going to allow you the opportunity to introduce yourself, and Courtney can introduce herself when she comes on board with us. So sit back and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Pavord. I think many of you know me. I've done this before, and I'm the training coordinator for the budget line of business. I've worked in the federal budget space for 10 years as budget director for SBA, deputy budget director for Treasury, and chief of staff of the CFO. And we're going to be joined in a few minutes by Courtney Timberlake, who was the assistant director for the budget review division at OMB, and she was the person who actually at OMB was in charge of our subject today, where we're going to talk about OMB Circular A-11. So the objectives of this is to really give you an overview. And A-11 is a big document. It's over 1,000 pages long, and there's a lot of stuff in there. And we're obviously not going to go through every little detail. We just want to give you an overview so you kind of understand what's in it. But as we do this, we're going to give you an introduction to certain terms and concepts in A-11. So that's what we're trying to do today. I will say I have the chat, and if you have a question, go ahead and ask it in the chat, and we will try to address it. But we also have something special going on today in this class. It's the second annual Budget Jeopardy Championship. So we had 2 players sign up, and if you would like to be the 3rd player, go ahead, get ready, put your name in the chat room, and you will get a chance to win the coveted Budget Line of Business mug. You know those people on Sunday night at the Oscars, they wish they could get a Budget Line of Business mug. So that's what we're going to do to kind of liven things up as we go through this class. So so be bold, be brave, sign up to be a contestant in the Budget Jeopardy. Okay, and we're going to play this game at various points, and we'll just ask questions just like real Jeopardy. The first one to answer gets control of the board, and then we'll play for a couple minutes at various points as we go through this material. Okay, any other questions on that? So some of you are new, some of you have been working in the federal budget process for a long time. And there's a lot going on, right? You can see all this stuff in the clouds here. There's scoring, apportionments. There's something called max data entry. There's how do you prepare budget estimates. Then there's things like object classification, all these weird terms, all these complicated process. How do you make sense of it all? When you're doing your daily task of budget execution and budget formulation. So fortunately, you have A-11, OMB Circular A-11 is your guide. It's what it can help. It's the official guidance that shows you how to do all this stuff. Now it's available at the website. Now currently it's not been published because the new administration, it needs to take its time to review the A-11 and it needs to put out its guidance. And that's an ongoing process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But it is the reference material on budget processes and the terms and concepts used in the budget process. So this is your go-to source on how the federal budget process works. It's the process. It outlines the process for agencies to communicate with Congress on budgetary issues. There are rules for how you communicate with Congress, and A-11 specifies those. It's the conceptual and procedural guidance to agencies on how you prepare and submit your budget estimates for the OMB submission. It's a guidance to agencies on budget execution, and it also talks about the federal performance framework. There's the other thing. So that's what people say when you hear about the term OMB Circular A-11. That's what they're talking about. But there's also, and this is a little bit confusing, something called OMB's Max A-11 budget system. So there's the document OMB Circular A-11, and there's the A-11 budget system. And this is a system that agencies use to enter data that ultimately shows up in the president's budget. And their agencies are required to submit their data into this system. So that's the first thing to learn. Make sure you understand that when we're talking about OMB Circular A-11, we're talking about a document, but then we talk about the budget system also is A-11. A little bit confusing, but there. So this is what I want to make sure everyone understands. OMB Circular A-11 reflects presidential priorities. It is a guidance document that is a means for implementing presidential priorities. Every administration rewrites A-11 to incorporate their priorities, right? That's a process that's ongoing now, because as I said before, that A-11 is not available on the web because OMB, they just got a new director and new political appointees. They will submit a new version of A-11 that will be the guidance, that will be authoritative. Once it's published, you are responsible for learning the guidance that's in A-11, and then you have to adjust everything in your office to reflect this new guidance, because it is guidance that is binding on agencies. So OMB Circular A-11 guidance is considered authoritative. It's based on statutes. It's rooted in statutes, things like the Budget and Accounting Act, the Anti-Deficiency Act, the Federal Credit Reform, Government Performance and Results Act, and things like that. I do not know when the A-11 will be released, and it's really up to the administration. And they've got a lot going on right now, right? We know with the new formulating the president's budget, all that stuff you see in the news. So I will not, I obviously don't speak for OMB, and I don't have insight into that question. But we can expect it will be out in the next few months, because the administration is going to want to put this out so that they can impart their guidance to the government. And OMB A-11 is reviewed by the Office of General Counsel at OMB to make sure that it's consistent with the laws, because this is legal guidance that's rooted in laws. Okay. So it covers the entire budget process, everything from laws, formulation and execution, talks about the congressional process. It tells you what laws govern the process. It defines key terms and budget concepts. It talks about what's included in the budget, and therefore tells you what's not included in the budget. And it talks about a concept called scoring. So these are big deals. Now, if you're familiar with OMB Circular A-11, and it's published normally every year, they publish the new version, and there's always some changes. Probably a lot more changes in the first year of a new administration than will be in subsequent years, but there's always changes. So it's a good idea to start your review by going to the front of the page, or the front of the new volume, and they'll tell you what the changes are. So it's usually published annually in the midsummer, July, early August. So maybe that's when the new administration will do the new budget. The last one was in August 23. That maybe need to be update that. But after the completion of the budget season, OMB issues a call for agencies to suggest changes to A-11. So if there's something you didn't understand, it was confusing, maybe didn't make sense, you can submit those changes to OMB, and then they will evaluate your suggestions and incorporate it in the new version. And they can be off cycle. I mean, OMB Circular A-11 is published at the direction of the director of OMB. And so if they want to change something in the middle of a cycle, they can publish an off-cycle change.
Hey, Andy.
Yeah. Oh, there you are.
Sorry about that. Yes. You all good? Do you want to
Yep.
do you want to finish up the slide, or do you want me to take over?
You take over and we'll go by the plan. Okay.
Okay. Sorry,
Good
everybody.
morning, Courtney.
Good morning,
Good
and
morning.
my apologies for the
Oh, that's okay.
late entry. I
that's
got
okay.
on. Yep.
Uh,
So
I
just
have Courtney.
please.
Excuse
Yep.
me, just 1 minute. Andy, if we can slow it down just a little bit.
Okay. Sorry.
Thanks.
So I'll start in the middle of the slide. Okay, so or I'll just start on this slide again. Okay, so Circular A-11, the updates. There are, as Andy probably told you, there are regular annual updates of OMB Circular A-11. And yes, the most recent updates listed here are a little out of date, but it's basically you can just take roughly August 2024 was the last version of A11 to be released. So, and after the completion of a budget season, so after the president's budget release, OMB will then issue a call for all of the agencies to suggest changes to A11 guidance. So this is a chance for staff and leadership at agencies to comment, make comments to OMB about, are there definitions that don't seem to make sense, or or are there better ways to describe the requirement or the action, the math even, to make A11 better and more clear for everybody who is using A11. And A11 is used by so many people because A11, if you're brand new to this and you are just opening up A11, you're going to realize that it has just about everything you'd ever want to know, and more, and a whole bunch of stuff you probably don't want to know because not everybody does all of the things that A11 covers. So, so that in particular is a big reason why, uh, after the completion of budget season, is a really, really good time to tell OMB about how you were able to follow the guidance in A11. OMB folks do the best they can to describe what what you as agency folks are supposed to do, and sometimes it just gets kind of fouled up, or it's just not clear, and particularly for new people, that's challenging. So the goal really is to be as clear as possible about the guidance, but that doesn't always happen. So tell OMB what your issues are. They really do take a look at those comments, and they do actually make changes as a result of those comments. You should also be aware and just stay apprised. There might be off-cycle updates published to OMB's website. There might be a change in a policy, or there might be a change in a law that requires updates to A11. So just be aware of that. Next slide, please.
So what we want to do is just go through this journey. And so OMB Circular A11 is broken up into 6 parts. And we portray in our corny little chart here that there's 6 different mountains that you have to climb, because they're all in and of themselves pretty complicated. They all have a ton of information. And so what we're going to do in the next few minutes is walk you through these 6 mountains, and so you can get an insight into them. Again, we're doing an overview. So let's start with general information, and it has these sections. Starts with overview of the budget process, talks about basic laws, terms and concepts, scoring, which is near and dear to Courtney's heart, and communications with Congress. So this is kind of the first mountain in the foundation of everything to come. So do you want to take this, or?
Sure.
Okay.
It's your call. Your call, Andy.
Okay, you go for it for a little bit, and then I'll
Okay,
take the next one.
sure. Okay, so we'll start with the overview of the budget process. And if you have been working already, for a little while in budget, some of this will, be very familiar to you. But this is also an opportunity to ask questions that you thought you shouldn't ask your boss or something like that, right? So let's start with the budget process. What is the budget? Well, when we talk about budget in the federal government, it means the president's budget. It's not anybody else's budget. It's not the agency budget. When you got the capital B in there, it's the budget of the United States government, and it's that multi-volume, that huge multi-volume stack that sometimes arrives to offices. Print is not as welcome anymore, but you can get it online. You can get it in hard copy. There are 4 significant volumes. The main budget volume is is basically describing the president's budget message and what the president is hoping that Congress will do, will enact when they go through their legislative process, whenever that actually happens. So that is the main volume is the big book. Well, actually, it's big in the sense that it is about all of the policy that the administration is hoping will get enacted. The budget appendix is for you guys who are working on, your programs. The appendix has detailed information by agency, bureau, or program group. It's by budget account, and it also goes by programs and activities. So you get different cuts of data. You get different cuts of the same set of data. So that depending on what you are specifically working on in your agency, you'll want different types of data, not surprisingly. Analytical perspectives has lots of numbers as well, but analytical perspectives tries to put the budget documents into context and describe some historical trends and also provides a bunch of data, although not quite as much as the historical tables volume, which provides an enormous amount of data on budget accounts going back decades, which you may or may not be interested in, but sometimes you will need to pull historical data to do a chart for somebody, and that's where you can get a lot of the data for it. And as noted at the bottom, not surprisingly, most of the information that is in the set of budget documents is or is based on information that was submitted by the agencies. So all of the data that you see in these volumes was submitted by agencies in accordance with A-11, and it is reviewed by OMB before it actually gets published. All of the budget volumes are reviewed by OMB staff as well as leadership. So the political heads at OMB also read chunks of the materials to make sure that it's in concert with administration policy. So let's talk about the actual budget process. There are 3 main phases of the budget process. You've got budget formulation, which is when agencies are trying to figure out, okay, what are the programs that they are going to that they are asking to operate for the next fiscal year, and how much is that going to cost? So the agencies have to come up with the estimates to present to OMB for the formulation process. So that's when all of the agencies, get their decisions after working with OMB, and the agencies then have to go put all of the data that is associated with those decisions, as well as prior year data or prior year and current year data into the OMB's Max A11 data entry module. It's not, it's sort of a system, but it's basically collecting all of the data so that it can be compiled and turned into those 4 or 5 volumes. So to release to the public. Then, of course, after budget formulation and after the president presents his proposal or his or her proposal to the Congress, then the congressional phase comes in, of course. And as probably most of you, if anybody's new here, you'll hear a lot from other folks, but you know, from the folks who have been around a while. But the congressional process has been excruciating, going back to the mid 1990s. So if you're new and you're saying, "Wow, why aren't things getting done?" Well, it's been a very long time since the process worked the way that it was supposed to. So it's not new. It's unfortunately now regular order. That's just the way that it has turned out. So Congress eventually will come up with an appropriations bill, whether it's a continuing resolution, you know, for the rest of the fiscal year, or Congress actually enacts amounts for each agency. Congress will eventually have to get something done. Once Congress and the administration have agreed, then it comes time for execution, of course. And in order for agencies to be able to execute their programs, they must go through the process of apportionment, which is agencies basically requesting funds from OMB while they're getting permission from OMB to go to Treasury and obligate funds for their programs. And that it doesn't stop there, because of course there will be lots of reporting on when obligations occurred and when those funds are expected to be outlaid, because Congress doesn't want agencies to just obligate money. They want to get the money out to do the projects and the programs that they are mandated to execute. One other item in here, mid-session review. So in addition to just, you know, basic execution throughout the year, there is a requirement in the law to send a report to the Congress that shows updated budget estimates, and that is supposed to be on or before July 15th. That has also been treated as a suggestion lately, but around July 15th, maybe even early August. But so be prepared for that. You'll see updated budget estimates. But when you use the economic assumptions for execution stay the same. So even though budget estimates are being updated, agencies have to pretend that they're back at the beginning of the fiscal year for execution. So you've got changes in economic assumptions, technical reestimates for program volume, for example. You know, you might be obligating more or less than what you originally expected in the president's budget. And Congress also will continue to act, and that may change the estimates of programs. So you should be aware of those changes. But when you are executing, again, stick with the original estimates.
So all this stuff is covered in Section 10. Let's go to, but Section 10 also talks about the key players. And Courtney, if you could talk about, it describes the key players in the budget process. So.
Yep. So OMB is the president's budget office. And the president is the one that submits the initial budget to the Congress, as I mentioned. But OMB is the, some people would say, the overlord of all of the agencies. And OMB, there are many things that agencies have to go and get permission from OMB to do. OMB works very closely with the Treasury, so the Bureau of Fiscal Service. They're the ones who make sure that payments get made for, to execute programs, that payments actually get out directly to people, not just to agencies, but directly to people. For example, SNAP. The Congressional Budget Office is an agency that is directed by the Congress, as you might guess. And CBO is looked at as a neutral arbiter, in the sense that there are different, that CBO comes up with different economic assumptions. They have their own mechanisms for making estimates of what Congress thinks is going to be the cost of a program. So CBO is sort of a check and balance that was enacted in, I believe it was 1970, or ish. It's in that ballpark. I should remember that, but somewhere in that ballpark. But it's just sort of, again, check and balance. GAO, the Government Accountability Office, goes and reviews how agencies did, in fact, execute their programs, and they will make suggestions for improvements to make things more efficient or more effective, and also to make sure that agency accounting, so financial statements, that sort of thing, that all of those are in order and that agencies are providing that type of data to the public as well.
Then we get to Section 15, which covers the key basic budget laws. And the Budget and Accounting Act, which is the basic law that sets up the idea that the president is the one that submits the budget. Because before this enactment in 1921, there was no centralized budget process. Each agency sent its own requests over to Congress. There was no one document. And that didn't work so well, so that the Budget and Accounting Act requires the president to send a full document to the Congress. And that was later amended to make it the first Monday in February. But things happen, for example, transitions. When there's a transition, it's not really fair to expect a president inaugurated on January 20th to submit a budget on February 1st. So things get delayed frequently. It also created what is called the Bureau of the Budget back then, and now is the Office of Management and Budget. And then, do you want to run through these quick, Courtney?
Sure. There are some really key basic budget laws. The Anti-Deficiency Act, I'll do this relatively quickly. The Anti-Deficiency Act, or ADA, is a law that requires agencies not to obligate more funds than the amounts that Congress appropriated, or that agencies have apportioned, that OMB has approved apportionments for, right? So it's not just, prohibition from spending more. It's also, it's also just, you can't even obligate more funds than you have had apportioned by OMB. And that is to make sure that agencies, this is at least one major reason, that is to keep agencies from from obligating all of their funds in like the first 6 months of the fiscal year. And then, we still have to operate the program for the rest of the year, so we need more money. It's to make sure that agencies are spreading out their obligations over the full course of the year. The Impoundment Control Act the president has to notify Congress whenever the executive branch wants to defer or to rescind budget authority. So it's basically a letter that has to go to the Congress. The Economy Act is an act that allows agencies or even bureaus within agencies to do work for each other. So some of you may have heard or be working on a project where one agency is doing something for another agency, and the first agency will pay that other agency to do the work. So it's really, if you think about it, it's really in concept a transfer from one agency to another, but it's really a payment to the other agency because goods and services are being provided. The Miscellaneous Receipts Act is not referred to very frequently, but the money that is received by the government has to be deposited into the Treasury as soon as practicable. So agencies cannot hold on to the money, not that they really would want to, but I mean, maybe they would. But the money has to flow through. It can't wait until the end of the fiscal year. So, Andy, you wanna?
Okay, keep going. And then these one I'll just cover real quick. These are the Government Performance Results Act that set up the performance management framework for the government. And Section 15 will have any guidance about that in it. So then it also talks about how does the Congress enact the budget? And it talks about how the Congress reviews the president's budget and develops a budget by approving 3 distinct kinds of measures. The Congress adopts a concurrent resolution this spring, and this is the budget resolution that you may have heard in the news, that the House has passed a budget resolution, the Senate has passed a budget resolution, and of course they're going to have to reconcile it. And the budget resolution sets the total framework for total receipts and outlays and major category expenditures. So that's the first thing that Congress does. But then it does legislation authorizing changes to mandatory spending programs and taxes that have to be enacted to make them consistent with the budget resolution. So the budget resolution includes something called reconciliation instructions, which tell authorizing committees, hey, you got to adjust your programs, the spending in your programs and taxes to reflect the budget totals in the president's budget. In the congressional budget resolutions. So these are listed in the budget resolution. And then Congress does the appropriations budget cycle, which is the appropriations committees have to pass appropriation bills that are within the limits set by the congressional budget resolution. So Section 15, if you have questions about what I just said, gives you the details on how Congress enacts the budget. And then we get into terms and concepts, Section 20. Budget data is complex, right? Think about all the things going on in the federal government, right? There's regular salaries and expenditures, right? But then there's loans and there's grants and there's information technology spending. There's revenue collected at parks. There's all this different stuff. So you need a language to understand that, right? And this is a key part of being a budget analyst, is learning this language. And Section 20 provides the answer to what I call the Rosetta Stone to try to understand all these different terms and concepts. And that's where if you have a question about a term that you hear and you don't know what it is, go to Section 20 of OMB Circular A-11. And then I'll turn this one over to, because this is Courtney's world. Section 21 talks about scoring.
So remember when I said that OMB and CBO have different economic assumptions? So scoring legislation means estimating the cost of that legislation. And as you might imagine, having different sets of economic assumptions between OMB and CBO means that the scoring, the estimated cost of legislation may be different between OMB and CBO. And as you might imagine, OMB tends to be on the rosier side of the economic forecast, and CBO tends to take a somewhat more conservative approach. That being said, you should know before. Okay, so you've got the scorekeepers. OMB is a scorekeeper, and CBO is a scorekeeper, and OMB and CBO actually they get along very well in most cases, and sometimes there are just significant disagreements. But OMB and CBO staff are always calling each other to say, hey, what do you think about this? And hey, I don't understand this provision because it seems like it would cost a lot of money. What do you think? And I mean, really, the OMB and CBO staff are great and they work well together for the most part. Obviously, there will always be differences, but they are the two scorekeepers. There are no other scorekeepers. And yes, there are differences between estimates because, again, as I mentioned, each agency's economic assumptions are different. So the estimates will naturally be different as a result of that. But OMB and CBO may also differ on how the program is going to be implemented. And there are so many variations on that it's hard to really get just one example, but there are lots. You can imagine, well, I want this program to be executed, quarterly, and or let me rephrase that, or monthly. And CBA, let's say that's what OMB wants, and CBO says, okay, no way are you going to get the money out the door on a monthly basis for a wide variety of reasons. You're
So
only going to get it out quarterly. Yep. And
there's a
so,
question. I'm
oh,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Who prevails at the end of the day, OMB or CBO?
Well, it depends on the definition of prevails, but so each agency will do its estimates, and in the president's budget, you will see the 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 biggest difficulty is when the differences between OMB and CBO exceed the budget resolution or exceed, an appropriations bill. So essentially, it really depends on the situation. But in the end, both agencies will work together to figure out, they're not going to necessarily get to the same numbers, but they are at least going to try to get to a point where they can agree on things and get the legislation done. Does that,
So,
go ahead, Andy.
but
Yeah.
wouldn't you say, like, up until the point the legislation is passed, during the legislative process, CBO is the ultimate authority, right? OMB can't tell the House budget committees
That's correct.
that
Yeah,
their estimates are wrong because it's the House and
that's
Senate
correct.
budget committees that CBO ultimately reports to. So up
Yep.
until the point the law is passed, it's CBO that is ultimately the decision, kind of
Yes.
the will prevail. But after the law is passed, when you're looking and evaluating laws and spending to see whether budget enforcement action is going to kick in, and the dreaded word sequester, which we'll talk about later, kicks in, at that point, it's OMB that sort of prevails.
Yes,
Is that
yes.
yes. So the answer is it depends when and that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. So just quickly, so you have to score for budget formulation so that Congress and the public know how much the administration is anticipating in funding. The congressional process and enactment, that is Congress basically doing scoring of the legislation with their own economic assumptions. And there are Babedka categories. So there's other legislation that impacts spending. So there are, and I'm not going to go into great detail on this because this is the Pay-as-you-go Act of 2010. That's a long story, but basically mandatory. You, you have to, if you spend more than if you it, I let's just do this. Mandatory is funds that have been provided been provided in a mandatory bill, and discretionary spending. So all of the discretionary programs provided by appropriations acts. Uh, so mandatory and discretionary funding.
So there's two kinds of committees in Congress as far as budget goes. There's the Appropriations Committee that do annual appropriations, and that's discretionary because it's up to the discretion of Congress how much they're going to fund each year. But then and that's about a quarter of the federal budget, and that's all the normal things you think about when you think about the government, the Department of Defense, the the IRS, the national parks, the Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs. That stuff is all appropriated at the discretion of Congress every year, and sometimes they'll do multi-year funding. But the other types of congressional committees are authorizing committees, and they pass mandatory funding bills. Mandatory funding is when Congress sets a condition under which somebody's going to get some money. So the classic example of that is Social Security. So when you turn 62 or 65 or 67, depending on which program you want to take, the government must give you your money. Disability is mandatory in the sense that if you meet a certain criteria as a veteran disability rating or a service-connected disability rating, the government must give you money. So mandatory funding is not a specific amount, it's a condition. And so what Congress does is says that if you're going to pass mandatory funding, you have to show that it's balance of zero. So if you want to increase, and taxes are part of this too, if you want to cut taxes that's going to reduce government revenue, you have to pay for it by finding savings or increasing other kinds of taxes. And that's what PAYGO's all about, is for mandatory funding, it must net to zero in a particular, it must net to zero. And there's some nuances to that.
And if it doesn't, then there is a sequestration.
So what we're gonna,
yeah. Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
and at the end of the year, they total it up and they do sequestration on mandatory funds. And that, so this is all complicated, and we know we won't be able to explain it all, but the key thing is section 21 is where you go to find out the answers to this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a break for, let's come back at 11:22 or something like that, and we'll take a break, and I guess I'll see you at 11:22, and we'll continue. Thank you for your interest. I'm just going to go off camera, and we'll see you at 11:22. Janice?
Yes.
I'm wondering if maybe since we're a little bit behind and we didn't have that much interest, that we skip the Jeopardy. What do you think?
If I'm with you if that's what you think.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll have to refigure that.
No problem.
It worked last year, but I think we're just because yeah, I want to slow down and we still have some slides to cover.
Okay. Sounds good.
Andy, we do have a thumbs up.
For what?
Check the chat.
Oh. Or update, subscribe to newsletter.
Rejuni Mata is interested.
Oh.
Thank you.
In the game?
Yeah, he signed up for, that's one of the contestants. That was the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if is Tara on here?
Yeah, they're gonna have to.
I didn't hear back.
Okay.
We'll get you, maybe we'll schedule a special, maybe we should just do a special
A special Jeopardy. Yeah.
a Jeopardy thing. We could announce that. That might be fun.
Yeah, that probably would be.
The Jeopardy and have teams and stuff.
Okay.
Something to talk about next Wednesday. Okay, we're gonna start in 3 minutes if you're listening.
Hey, Andy, I think
Yeah.
somebody wanted the slide that's after the slide about how do you make sense of the federal budget process, and let me see what the next one is, if I can. Hold on.
July.
I think since you have the control,
They
so
want
it's the one after the clouds.
July or August.
this one?
Yeah. I think it was that one that somebody wanted to.
That would be my
Yep.
capacity going back. With everything, so I would say July or August.
Yeah. What do you want me to? They want them to put it in a thing or what? I'm
Maybe,
not sure.
yeah, can you copy it to the chat? Is that possible?
Legacy stuff, it's kind of separate things.
Never done that before, but you learn something every day.
ARM is trying to reconcile.
I think you can.
I mean, date and I'll call Seth. and-
There you go. Is this the one you wanted?
That's all reconciled.
Andy,
They have to-
also a copy of the presentation was linked to the invite, and also let me put the link in there
Oh, yeah, that's right.
that they can retrieve the slides.
Yeah, that's probably better than
Yep.
trying to put a bunch of slides in there.
Okay.
invoicing
For whomever's requesting,
by all government-
here is the link to access the slides.
Get a HUD 20 from our to we have the current money start date. Tried to still kind of reconciling.
Okay, we're going to start in about 30 seconds. And Courtney, you'll take this slide
Yep.
and then we'll go forward.
Okay. You want me to start?
Yep.
Okay. So there are lots of requirements on communicating with Congress, the public, and even other agencies, but not so much. Budget deliberations are confidential. Decisions and the underlying materials for those decisions are confidential. Just do not, please, don't release presidential decisions outside of your agency until the budget actually goes to Congress, and just don't, trust me. The materials, there are specific reasons and processes for disclosing the materials that underlie those decisions. And there are also cases where out-year data is considered pre-decisional and requires OMB approval to be released. So there are lots of ways that you can get tripped up in terms of providing data. So always, always, always check with your boss on whether something can be released to a non-governmental party. Okay, so that's the deal.
Okay, and we'll skip this. Wait, I'm sorry. Something happened here that I didn't plan on. So we're now moving into part 2, which is preparation and submission of the budget estimates. And there's a lot in this section. You can see in part 2, there's a whole bunch of sections, right? 32, all these sections. And we're not obviously going to talk about all of them, but we'll hit the highlights of a certain key sections. So let's start with section 25. And this is summary of requirements. And I want to emphasize that this is something that may change with the new administration, because what they require in the budget request, they may adjust. But in the previous version, and it includes these things as part of your budget request. And the key point here is that you have to work with your OMB examiner for them to tell you exactly what they want so that they can make the best recommendation to the director about what will be in passback for your agency. So as part of your budget request, the OMB examiner tells you what to submit. But then there's after passback. Now, the OMB gets the budget request, they analyze the budget request, the director makes decisions, and then they pass back the decisions to the agencies in November, usually at the end of November. But then at the same time, OMB issues information about the CY, the current year, and the budget Y year. And at this point, after passback, OMB is going to tell you what you need to put into max and things like that, the narrative text and the actual data. So this is the two parts of your requirements. You have what you send to OMB and as part of your budget estimate, and usually in September, and then information you submit after passback in November. Section 31 covers policy, laws, and other general requirements. It says that the basis of proposals should be a comprehensive system. OMB wants you to think totally about your budget request. And it includes things like analysis, performance management, strategic planning, evaluation, enterprise risk management. They also want to know about the effect of demographic, economic, or other changes you have on your program levels beyond the budget year. And meet my cat. Impact program levels. What is the impact of program levels? So if you do more of something, how much will that cost? If you do less of something, how much will that cost? And what are the appropriate roles for federal, state, and local governments? They want you to consider that as part of your proposals. Then we get into section 32, which is personal compensation, benefits, and related costs. Pay scales. And here is where the key thing is. They include generally an assumption for the pay raise. Now, this assumption is from an old version of OMB Circular A-11. We'll get new assumptions when the new version comes out. It also provides guidance for things like awards, benefit payments, and retirement costs and other items. Next, we have section 51. Maybe, Courtney, you want to talk about this a little bit?
Sure. So agencies have to talk about what's the justification for the proposals that you're making. So these are the highlights that agencies should hit when they're developing their materials. What are the big policies and what's the strategy for getting those policies done? How much is it going to cost? Discretionary and mandatory resources. You've got to estimate those. You have to explain how the policies and strategies and resources that you're going to request, how does that match up with what OMB has dictated to the agencies in terms of planning? What are they planning for the next budget year? You should flag if there are any big differences from what the current administration supports. And it is important to provide a thorough discussion of the evidence for big proposed policies, including you'd want evaluation results or performance indicators. You also want, if you have data analytics and research studies, throw them in. Make sure that you've got as much data as you can to support your proposals. Next slide, please. Yeah.
And then general
Yep.
requirements.
Yeah, and then if there are any big proposals for change in the current year budget, you've got to provide lots of backup on that, and why this change is needed now. Other requirements are any big proposals or changes in spending patterns beyond the budget year. There's also a requirement for a separate submission that justifies additional funding for individual programs that are higher than the guidance levels for the budget year. So basically, you're asking for more money in the budget year, additional money, and you could identify any potential discretionary offsets in lower priority programs to get that done. You also, it's not just about the dollars, but you also have to flag big changes in FTE, full-time equivalent. So basically staff numbers. So you have to justify that as well.
And some more things.
And there are lots of requirements. You can read this. This is just a list of, here are the big things you have to do.
And then we do want to emphasize that these things may change with the new administration. They may look for different types of information, and it's their prerogative to request what they want. And then, they do say you should use charts and graphs to amplify your message, which is just basic good communication, and coordinate with other agencies that are involved with, programs. So, because some programs cross across different agencies, and you should coordinate that. And include any new appropriation languages or changes to appropriation languages. Let them know, so they can work out the details of what the president will include in the appendix. So we're going to skip through this. And then we get to section 3, the budget data system. This is Courtney's favorite thing, I think, in the whole world, the MAX budget data system. I think there are so many people across government who have just enjoyed the experience of interacting with MAX A-11. It is painful. We're laughing because to get it to balance and get everything entered right is a painful experience for many people, especially people new to the federal budget process. But we have to emphasize how important it is, because the numbers that go into that system are the numbers that go into the president's budget appendix, which has the detailed information that ultimately drive congressional decisions about what's in appropriation laws.
Because all of that data gets provided to Congress. So it's not like there's a summary that Congress gets and that's it. They get all of the data. So just so it's very important to get that right.
And there's this concept of exercises. So for each phase in the budget formulation process, like the president's budget phase, and the budget appropriation language, and the narrative, there's what's called an exercise where you enter the data appropriate to that phase. And of course, remember, the federal budget is built on accounts that are used to store account codes that you use to store the data. Section 80 is, why don't you take this one, Courtney, and talk about what a baseline estimate is.
Sure. Baseline estimate is you're making projections about how much money, how much funding is available, how much is going to get spent, and how much is going to get collected by the government based on current laws. So whatever the laws are today, what's the estimate of all of those things over time, with no changes to the laws right now. As well as a projection of the current year resources, outlays, and receipts for discretionary programs. Agencies have to submit these estimates from budget year through BY+9. OMB baseline estimates follow the rule. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just so you know, OMB baseline estimates follow a very specific law, the BEDCA, And so agencies have to pay attention to what those rules are when they're estimating what the baseline is. So
This is my
go
favorite
ahead.
part of the
Yeah.
budget. Section 82 is the combined Schedule X, and this describes the data that is entered into the MAX data system. And there's the Schedule P, which is the program and financing schedule, which is printed in the president's budget appendix. So Schedule P is the data that goes into the P&F tables of the president's budget appendix. Schedule A is presidential policy data, which shows the budget authority and outlays that for president policy decisions and requests that are embedded in the budget. And then there's President Schedule S for expenditure accounts. And the thing is that it's the same data structure for all these schedules. So that and think about that. You know, we have this big complicated government, and we need to use the same terminology consistently across the government. And that's what Section 82 does. So I want to go back. So all the terms, a lot of terms that you hear about are described in Section 82. Things like unobligated balances, transfers, and all these terminology. A lot of it is laid out in Section 82, and that's the terminology that explains kind of what funding is. Is it reimbursables? Is it things like that? So Section 82 is really key for budget analysts to understand. And then Section 83 explains object classification, which you may have heard of, but it basically explains what items or services are purchased by the government. Now it's obligations, and an obligation is different than an outlay. An obligation occurs when the government makes a commitment to purchase something, or it becomes obligated to purchase something. So when you sign a contract, you obligate the funds. When you have employees, that the government is obligated to pay them. An outlay is when the funds are actually paid for. So I have a contract. I sign my contract, the government has obligated the funds to pay my firm. But when I provide the service, like this class, I send an invoice, and then the government pays me. That is an outlay. So these are the basic categories, but you can see from the President's Budget Appendix that it creates a table that shows the total obligations and what you spent: people, contracts, supplies, equipment, etc. So Section 95 talks about the budget appendix and print materials. It basically contains the appropriation language proposed by the president. So this is like if the president got everything he wanted, it would be all the language in this section.
And the appendix provides a lot. It's the thickest volume of the budget when it's in hard copy. And it's got for data for the past year, so the year that's already done, the current year, and then the budget year.
And it's about, I think the last one was about 1,200 plus pages, so it's lengthy.
Yes, just the one volume. Yes.
Yeah. So Section 100 on sequestration. Again, we're giving you kind of the tip of the iceberg, but you got to go look into it to learn more. And so, Courtney, could you talk about sequestration, which is an interesting concept?
So for a period of time, Congress was very interested in trying to reduce the amount of money provided by Congress, and there were laws enacted that basically capped the amount of discretionary funding that could be provided. And if agencies, essentially the first sentence is the key. It's the cancellation of budgetary resources in order to get down to a specified cap level. This was incredibly difficult. Neither Democrats nor Republicans enjoyed any of this process. I had to live through it a couple of times. It was not pretty. And so although we have this slide in here, this hasn't happened in quite some time. It is possible that sequestration could be potentially restored, but the idea would be to say, okay, we have a cap on the amount of budget authority that can be obligated. If more is obligated, then you've got to cut spending somewhere else in order to get back down to the cap. So it was intended to keep budget authority at a specified level.
So
It's very complicated, and that's about the easiest way to describe it.
yeah,
Andy?
Congress started this concept because the issue is that Congress is worried about budget deficits, right? And the president is too. And they've been worried about deficits for a long time. And who enacts all these deficits? It's Congress. So Congress was thinking about how can we come up with a way to limit ourselves and stop ourselves from overspending? How do we keep ourselves from grabbing that extra cookie in the cookie jar? When we know we shouldn't have it, we shouldn't spend that extra money, but we keep doing it. So they came up with this concept called sequestration, which, as Courtney said, is the cancellation of budget resources if you have too many cookies. If you run your deficit, they're going to force you to go on a diet if you do too much stuff. So there's two kinds of spending. There's mandatory spending, right? And there's discretionary. For mandatory spending, we're still under, I think this is right, Courtney, the rules of this law called BEDCA, which was enacted in
Yes.
1985, which is the pay-go thing we talked about before. So any law that has more than it's supposed to, it is considered pay-go. But it's not done on individual laws. It's done throughout a congressional session. So at the end of a congressional session, OMB issues a report and said, did you spend too much or did you spend too little? Did you give too many tax cuts and not enough tax increases or spending cuts? And if OMB says that, they do a report every year, then they have to sequester, which means cancel budget authority for mandatory programs. Now they exempt some mandatory programs like Social Security, but that's a painful thing. For discretionary programs, and again enacted by Appropriations Committee, there they set budget limits in various laws, right? The latest one is the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, and where they set spending limits. But none of those spending limits that are being considered now are in excess of those limits. In fact, they want to, they want to cut it below those spending limits. So sequestration really isn't on the table right now. Does that cover it?
And it's also fair to say that there's only been one actual cutting in the many years of trying to enforce caps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it was
ugly.
supposed to be a threat that would force Congress to balance, reduce the deficit, and you can judge for yourselves how that's gone. So then we get into part 3, which is actions following the transmission of the budget. And this is a smaller mountain. There's only 3 sections here. And we'll just talk about section 110, which has become a key thing because you have the normal appropriation process, but then you have supplementals that have been, and we've had some big bills in the last few years that are supplemental, not part of the regular appropriation process. So this has the policy in section 110 for supplementals and amendments.
And supplementals are usually for, say, disasters. If there's it's for unexpected contingencies.
Yeah.
So yeah, so if there's a big hurricane and more money is needed to help out the area that was hit by the hurricane, that's where you'll find a supplemental.
And so OMB will only consider requests for supplementals and amendments when existing law requires payments within the fiscal year for pensions and stuff like that. The unforeseen emergency situations, there's new ideas out there and things like that. But this is the guidance for agencies to request supplementals, which I think it's fair to say OMB does not take lightly. I guess that would be a fair way to say it.
Yep.
So if your agency thinks it needs a supplemental for any of these reasons here, this is the process for requesting a supplemental. Because you cannot, one thing you cannot do as an agency is go directly to Congress. That is forbidden by the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. And then deferrals and presidential proposals to rescind or cancel funds. This will be significantly revised by the new administration because they have ideas on this that they will put in the new law. And I'm sorry, in the new version of OMB Circular A-11. So we'll get into budget execution now. This is really important because, you pass the laws, but you need to execute the funding in accordance with the laws and hopefully to get the best value for the American people. And so this is some pretty significant sections. The first section is apportionments, and I will note that we're having a class on apportionments in detail tomorrow. But Courtney, you want to explain what's in section 120?
Sure. So apportionments allow agencies to obligate their funds for their programs. OMB has to approve an apportionment form. So agencies will send in apportionments for their individual budget accounts. And most of them, some of them are exempt, but most of them have to get approved by OMB and signed by the OMB Deputy Associate Director in charge of their programs. So this is a legal document, and there are legal penalties for not following what's in there. So apportionments limit the obligations you can incur for time periods, programs, activities, projects, objects, or any combination. And the apportionment, as I said, is legally binding. So there are legal penalties for exceeding an apportionment and have to get reported to Congress under the Anti-Deficiency Act. So it is bad to exceed an apportionment. So don't do it.
If you exceed an apportionment, in theory, you can be put in jail from the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Yes.
In reality, your secretary has to write a letter to the presidents, and secretaries do not like to write letters to the presidents about this. And you, as a finance person, you do not want to be involved with that. So Section 120 provides the format for apportionments, which is the SF 132, and it goes in some detail on what was it. It goes into great detail about what is required in each part of the apportionment. Mm-hmm. Again, we're going to cover this tomorrow in the class in more detail. So we'll just show you the form here, and you can see it. It breaks it first by budgetary resources up at the top, and then application of budgetary resources by either time period or program. And again, we'll cover that tomorrow.
And there are differences in the forms between a 1-year appropriation and
we lost. And 1 year and other types of fundings, because there can be multi-year funding, and that requires a different kinds of apportionment. And the other thing to talk about is Section 123 talks about something that we're dealing with all the time these days, which is apportionments under continuing resolutions. We seem to have lost Courtney. So continuing resolutions.
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, we're talking about apportionments under continuing resolutions.
So CRs are resolutions, and you have probably, if unless you are very brand new, you have probably experienced a CR. A CR is when Congress can't come to agreement on funding for the new fiscal year. So the agencies will operate. So as long as a law as a continuing resolution has been enacted, the agencies can continue to operate their programs for as long as the bill, the CR, will let you. Sometimes there are CRs that run the full fiscal year, where Congress is not going to come to agreement, and so they stick with basically repeating the prior year amounts in the next year. So, right, when the appropriations bills are not passed on time, or when the president has vetoed appropriations bills. Short-term CRs, you'll hear that term a lot too, because Congress will say, oh, we'll be able to work this out in, the course of, say, 3 months. And then it doesn't happen. And so then they have to enact another short-term CR to keep the government from closing down. So for a short-term CR, OMB will issue a bulletin to automatically apportion funds. And I did not catch the full question that came in. There have been CRs just about every year since the 1990s.
Yeah.
So I think that answers, or at least part of the question.
So the
Oh,
question about
okay.
full year CRs, we haven't had too many full year CRs because usually what happens is that CR goes on for 3 or 5 or 6 months, and then they do what's called an omnibus bill. And an omnibus bill is when instead of the normal 12 appropriation bills, they just lump everything into one big bill. And so normally that's what's been happening most of the time. This year, we may have a full year CR. If you follow the news, the Speaker of the House has proposed a full year CR. The President of the United States has endorsed a full year CR. So we'll see what they work out in the next few weeks. And we're not going to speculate on what we think is going to happen. I just I don't want to do that because anything I say will end up, because I have no inside information. I'm not like, so it'd just be pure speculation, and I don't want to do that. Can you go over the ways days covered by a CR are counted in the case of a multiple CR? Well, it's basically, if the first CR is 10 days, you spend for 10. And then if you add on 5 days, it just keeps adding on. So it's just, each increment. And there have been years where we've had like 7, 8, 9 CRs, and they get really annoying.
It's like mini bills, it's like a bunch of mini bills there for, as Andy pointed out, a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's only 5 days. I mean, there have been CRs short term that are so short term it's been only a few days because, oh, well, we're going to get to agreement. And then turns out agreement didn't happen. And so they'll do it for another week or a month or 6 months or whatever. So it can be for just about any time period.
So Section 124 talks about agency operations in the absence of appropriations. And this is the infamous shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
The current CR ends on March 14th. If that happens, there will be a shutdown. And Attorney General opinions hold that the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits agency officials from incurring obligations in the absence of appropriations. So that's why the government has to shut down. There's an article in the Constitution that says that no money may be spent unless it's appropriated by law. That's in the Constitution. So if you don't have an appropriation, you cannot spend money. And so Congress, if it fails to enact a regular appropriation and it doesn't have a continuing resolution, or there's not a supplemental, you can have a lapse in appropriations. Now, the law does recognize, and OMB recognizes, that there's certain important things that can't be shut down. Like we're not going to take, nurses out of an intensive care unit at the veterans hospitals. There are things that are so key to life that they will continue under a shutdown. It is up to OMB and under the guidance of the president to make the determination of to what activities are essential under the criteria established in this Section 124. They get to make that call. And that, of course, is a very important call. And Courtney, do you have any insight or comments on that?
No, the idea is that you should have the minimal amount. You should have a minimal amount of staff who are working during a shutdown. And I think the term now is accepted because you get into, is this really an essential service? Is that you get into all of those questions. So OMB work to figure out and get agreement on what was considered accepted. And so there's not a big fight with Congress over that. That's all I wanted
Okay.
to add. Yep.
So section 3130 talks about the SF 133, which is the report on budget execution and budgetary resources. And this is the report because there's a provision in the Constitution that says the president must report on financial on conditions. And so this is the report on that explains that. And again, it's broken down into sections, the budgetary resources, which tells you how much funding is available in the account. And then it talks about the obligations of budgetary resources and outlays. And this is to provide Congress on information on how much money is actually being obligated and outlaid. It's a big deal. It's complicated. Agencies submit this information monthly, and this talks about it. The actual SF-133s are worked on in conjunction with Treasury. And did I cover everything? Anything else, Courtney, here?
Yep, I think that's it.
Okay. Requirements for reporting Anti-Deficiency Act violations. We talked about this earlier. If your agency, for whatever reason, spends more than it has been apportioned, it is in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act.
And Andy, hey Andy, can I just, you can't, you said spending, and I just want to be very clear.
Oh, I'm
It's
sorry.
It's the obligation. It is, if you cannot obligate more funds than you have, basically. And you can't obligate your entire appropriation, at the beginning of the year, because then you won't have more fund. That presumes that Congress will provide you more funding for the rest of the year.
So you can't enter into contracts. So don't sign a contract that obligates the government to more money than more budget authority than you have. Okay, and what this section does, though, if these things happen, and they do happen occasionally, and sometimes it's just for a mistake.
Yeah.
This is the information on how to report it, because you are required to report it. And this is a letter. This is a letter you do not want to have to write, but this is a draft letter that reports the violation in court, explains it. You describe the nature of the violation, and then you explain the actions that, make sure it never is going to happen again, and whether your accounting system was approved and appropriate. And then you can, some other things here you have to explain. But this has to be signed by the agency head. And agency heads don't like signing this, right? Because it's so you want to avoid this.
And it goes to the White House.
Yeah. So we're at 1155. There are other sections. This talks about the administrative control of funds, which is basically the process for making sure that you don't exceed the obligations that you're allowed. The law says that agencies are responsible for managing their funds and controlling their funds in ways that make sure that an Anti-Deficiency Act violation does not occur. And then there's a whole section in federal Part 5, which is the federal credit, which we will not talk about, but that's really big, important thing. And then, we can go through there. And then there's appendices that are in the circular about scorekeeping guidelines, various special topics like treatment of leases, listing of treasury codes, the 132, which has the alignment between 132's apportionments and 133 budget execution, and various other things.
And if you need any of these, these appendices, I think, are some of the best written and clearest. They're not all, but many of them in here are some of the clearest on very complicated topics. So definitely refer to them.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our time, and we have 1 minute or so for any questions if you have. Otherwise, we'll turn it back over to Janice to close this out.
Are there any questions? Courtney and Andy? If not, on behalf of Budget Line of Business, we have a question. Okay.
Marguerite, go ahead. Just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, the question I have relates to the ADA section. In section 20.10, it suggests that reimbursable authority without a cash advance does not provide an agency with authority to make outlays. Is there anything that directly says that that outlay amounts being temporarily issued to cover that basically outlaid amounts being temporarily covered through direct appropriated cash to be later reimbursed is also not allowed? Is there anything specific in A11 that goes to that level of detail?
Courtney, you're muted.
Thank you. I don't think that there is any guidance that directly addresses your question. And even if there were, I would say go to your agency counsel, because I know that there are several agencies that have to deal with these types of issues, and sometimes the descriptions and the processes and the outcomes are so different. It's hard to give a stock answer, if that makes sense. It really will depend on the circumstances. I'm sorry, I can't give you something.
No worries. I just want to see
more
if there was
specific,
anything that I
Marguerite.
missed in the circular that addressed that specifically. So thank you.
The situations can be myriad. So, and nice to hear from you.
Likewise.
Okay, Janice.
All right, on behalf of Budget LoB, let us all just use our emojis and thank you to our presenters for the day. Did an excellent job. We appreciate you. And on behalf of Budget LoB, we'd like to say thank you for joining us today. You can join us in the next session at 1 o'clock. I'll post that in the chat just in case you do not have a link for that. Other than that, if you're not joining us for the next session at 1 o'clock, we'd like to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.